Jimmy Jones and His Wonderful Perpetual Motion Machine by Philip J. Moss. Narrated by the author. Produced by Nathan LaMontagne. Where were you and what were you doing on July 9th, 2003, the day that Jimmy Jones created his wonderful perpetual motion machine? I know where I was. Working at the bench next to Jimmy in the shop at Camp Big Honkers in Raymond, Maine, only its real name is Camp G Honka. The older boys wouldn't tell us why they called it Camp Big Honkers. I lived in New York, but Jimmy grew up in Maine. We were both 9 years old that summer, and it was our third season at camp together. I was making an ashtray. My parents didn't smoke, and I didn't know any grown-ups who did, but it was easy to make, and I was all thumbs when it came to working with tools, so each summer I made another ashtray. I think my mom gave them to our relatives to use as candy dishes. But Jimmy was really cool with making things. Our first season at camp, when we were only 7, he made a clock that really worked, and the next summer he made a little robot, a mechanical spider that had sensors and everything. It would crawl around on the bench, and when it ran into something, it would back up and go around it. I was painting my ashtray, and I looked over at Jimmy just as he hit the switch. The wheel started to revolve, and in a few seconds it was turning pretty good, and the little flashlight bulbs lit up and spelled out Mom. "Hey, that's cool. What is it?" Jimmy shrugged. "I don't know, just hacking around." I reached out and picked it up. The wheel kept on turning and the lights went on and off around the letters M-O-M. "I'll bet this eats batteries, huh?" Jimmy smiled slyly. "No batteries." "Cool." I put it back on the bench and went back to work on my ashtray. Mr. Jeffords came by. He was in charge of shop, and he seemed pretty excited by what Jimmy had done. He kept on asking Jimmy questions, and Jimmy kept shrugging, until the bell rang for afternoon swim, and we all ran out to get our trunks on and go down to the dock with our towels. At supper, Mr. Jeffords went over to the head table and was talking real fast to Art Slocum, the camp director, and they were both looking over at where Jimmy was sitting across from me. Parents were not allowed to visit their kids for the first 2 weeks of camp. That was because some of the new kids always got weepy if they saw their parents too soon, and other kids would get weepy if they saw that some kids got visits but they didn't. Anyway, my parents didn't come up because they lived so far away, but Jimmy's parents came up and took me and him out to lunch. His dad was a science teacher, I think, and his mom wrote music. I liked them because they didn't ask a lot of stupid questions like most grown-ups do. You know, how do you like camp, and how many brothers and sisters do you have? Instead, Jimmy's dad asked me if I had caught any frogs. When we got back, both Mr. Slocum and Mr. Jeffords were waiting to talk to Jimmy's parents, and Jimmy and I sat in the big chairs out front of the dining hall that had been carved out of tree trunks and had totem pole faces. Mr. Jeffords had a cardboard box that he put down on the ground, and he took Jimmy's wheel out of the box and handed it to Jimmy's dad. He, Mr. Jeffords, was talking and waving his hands around and getting real excited, but Jimmy's dad just smiled and said something in a low voice that I couldn't hear, and handed the wheel back to Mr. Jeffords, who looked real disappointed. He started talking again, and I could see Jimmy's dad frowning, and this time I could hear him real good when he said no, and he and Jimmy's mom turned away. Mr. Slocum took Mr. Jeffords by the arm, and he stood there with his shoulders kind of slumped, holding Jimmy's wheel in his hands. I don't know how word got out, whether it was Mr. Jeffords who called them, or maybe he told his wife and she told someone who called them. But a few days later, a television crew showed up at camp for some show called Unexplained Mysteries of the Universe or something, and wanted to talk to Jimmy, only Mr. Slocum wouldn't let them. The next day, Jimmy's dad showed up and took Jimmy out of camp. He gave me his frog collection, but still, I hated to see him go. My own parents came up to visit halfway through the camp season, and they told me that they had seen a story about our camp on the news. The news guy showed pictures of the camp and everything, and said that one of the kids here had done the impossible by inventing a perpetual motion machine. I said that was Jimmy, and I told Mom and Dad that Jimmy made it in shop where I made my ashtray. "Hey, Carl, look at this." Jonesy waved me over to look at his screen. I made sure that I came up on his left side so that I didn't accidentally get a whiff of smoke from the cigarette that he held in his right hand. Jonesy got to smoke at his desk only because he had some high-tech ashtray that sucked the smoke right in so that it didn't pollute the whole place. And mostly it worked, except when he got excited and exhaled in the direction of whoever he was talking to. I leaned over and looked at the summary scrolling across his computer. He stabbed at the screen with his right hand, and I got a face full of smoke. That item there. 9-year-old boy invents perpetual motion machine. Scientists amazed. What about it, Jonesy? We see stuff like that every day. Right next to the Milkmaid Travels to Saturn in UFO has Elvis's baby stories. I started to turn away, but Jonesy grabbed me by my belt and dragged me back. Look at the source. It's Popular Mechanics, not the National Masturbator. I looked, and he was right. And that was very, very odd, because Popular Mechanics was not given to outright sensationalism. Pull up the story, I said, but Jonesy was already doing it. The earliest known proposal for a perpetual motion machine dates back to the 13th century, and the U.S. Patent Office has received so many applications to patent perpetual motion machines over the past 200 years that it finally issued a public notice that it would no longer accept such applications without a working model. Well, if reports issuing from Raymond, Maine are to be believed, a 9-year-old boy has done just that. Stephen Jeffords is the director of shop classes at a summer camp in Raymond and an instructor in the Maine Technical College system. In July, according to Jeffords, one of the kids attending his camp constructed a machine that turns the wheel at 60 RPM, even though it has no batteries and no other apparent energy supply. Jeffords has the machine on display in his classroom and has challenged the other faculty at the college to find the source of energy that is powering the wheel. The head of Jeffords' department, Wayne Unger, was contacted by Popular Mechanics and confirmed that, as far as he can tell, the device has no power source. Unger has formally requested the engineering department of the University of Maine to examine the device. Okay, so what? Jonesy shrugged and ground out his cigarette. I don't know. I thought you might run it on the teaser. I looked at my watch. Send Sally with the crew up to Lewiston to check it out. We can give it 10 seconds in the teaser at 5 and 90 at the end of the slot. Salvatore Sonnenblick was the local interest features guy at station KLOK out of Portland. It was his job to be the booster of all things Maine, not to play the cynic. But this, he felt, was asking too much, and he complained loudly and long to his driver and cameraman, Roy Fecto. For shit's sake, Roy, I can't believe they've got me running down a story on perpetual motion machines. I know I'm not going to get a Pulitzer on this beat, but I'm some kind of journalist, for Christ's sake, not a shill for Jerry Springer. Roy didn't say anything. He hardly ever did. But he managed to look sympathetic, at least to Sally's eyes. And it was this combination of reticence and sympathetic manner that helped him get along with Sally and every other reporter at the affiliate. Privately, he thought that Sally was an asshole. Roy was also a native of Lewiston, Auburn, and as he piloted the van with the satellite dish on top up the road to the campus of the Technical College in Auburn, he occasionally waved at drivers and pickup trucks going the other direction. Roy hoisted the Steadicam to his shoulder and followed Sally inside. They found Jeffords in his classroom. Although it was 3:30 and Jeffords' last class had ended at 3, there was a crowd of students surrounding the bench on which Jimmy Jones' wheel was revolving, spelling out "Mom" with little flashlight bulbs. Roy hung back to film the scene while Sally went up to Jeffords and introduced himself. "Is this it?" Sally inspected the device. The wheel was about 10 inches in diameter and was mounted on a base that was about 14 inches by 8 inches. The bulbs were mounted on a piece of wood that was mounted upright parallel to the wheel against the long side of the base. The wheel spun a shaft that was wrapped in copper wire and surrounded by magnets, and some insulated wires connected the magnets to the bulbs, but that was it. "What makes it work?" Sally asked. "I'm damned if I know," said Jeffords. When the doorbell rang, Jimmy was trying to beat his own personal best at blaster ball. Totally absorbed in the game and with the sound turned up to the max, He didn't hear the bell, and he didn't hear his mother call him. When she tapped him on the shoulder, he paused the game and twisted round in his seat to look at her. "Come downstairs, Jimmy. There are some people here to see you." Jimmy bounced down the stairs, his mother following at a more sedate pace. His dad was in the living room with two men, one of whom was old, at least as old as his dad, and the other was young, with an earring and a goatee. "Jimmy, these men are engineers from the university. They'd like to ask you about the thing you made at camp this summer." Jimmy went over and stood next to where his dad was sitting. The old guy smiled at him. "Jimmy, my name is Dan Woods. I teach engineering at the university. This is Philip Winnick. He's an instructor in my department." The young dude gave a small wave. "We spent all day yesterday looking at your... What exactly do you call it, anyway?" Jimmy shrugged. "I don't have a name for it." "Well, we found it very interesting. Can you tell us how it works?" Jimmy looked at his dad before answering. "No." Woods looked startled. "Why not?" "I don't know how." "You don't know how it works?" "I don't know how to explain it." Silence. Then Winnick spoke. "Do you know how it works?" Jimmy nodded. "Then why can't you explain it?" "I don't have the words." Jimmy's dad tousled his hair. "Okay, Jimmy, go do your homework." Jimmy clattered up the stairs and slammed his door. Jimmy's dad raised his eyebrows and looked at the other two men, as if to say, "Well?" Woods cleared his throat. "Mr. Jones," he started, and then stopped. Winnick stepped in. "Mr. Jones, we measured the output of Jimmy's device at a constant 50.7 watts. We can find no power source." He stopped, and Woods spoke. "Your son's little machine is impossible," he blurted. "It defies the laws of entropy. We locked the damn thing in a lead box in a room that is insulated 6 ways from Sunday, and still it kept turning that damn wheel." Now he really did look old. "And your son says that he doesn't have the words to explain it to us." Jimmy's dad started packing tobacco into a pipe. "You seem to forget that he's only 9. Why don't you come back when he's finished high school? Maybe he'll be able to explain it then." Winnick leaned forward in his seat. "Mr. Jones, your son's invention turns all of conventional physics on its head. I can hardly sit still, and you want me to wait another 9 years to find out how it works?" "You seem to forget, Mr. Winnick, that this isn't about you," Jimmy's dad said stiffly. "Anyway, I don't see what you expect me to do." Winnick and Woods exchanged glances. "We, that is, the university," Woods started. "We want to enroll Jimmy in a special accelerated physics program," said Winnick. "We've been talking to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. They're prepared to back an effort to tutor Jimmy so that he can learn what he needs in order to tell us how this thing works." Jimmy's dad stared at the two men for a long 10 seconds. "Absolutely not." He stood up. "I appreciate your interest, gentlemen, but Jimmy is going to have a normal childhood." Winnick stood up also, but Woods remained seated. "The university will give your son a full scholarship at any college he chooses, Mr. Jones, and it will pay for 4 years of graduate school for him as well." He paused. "It will be hard for you to do that for him on a teacher's salary." Jimmy's dad swallowed hard. "Get out," he said. But the universe was bearing down on the Jones household, and it was gaining momentum. "Echo 1, this is Bald Eagle. Do you copy? Over." Crackle of static. "Bald Eagle, this is Echo 1. Read you 5x5. Over." Echo 1 wore a headset with a wire mic poised in front of his lips, which allowed his hands to roam over the dials and switches in front of him, tweaking this and adjusting that, while his eyes scanned the bank of monitors in front of him. The van containing Echo 1 and his $1.7 million of gear was parked on the street across from the Jones house. Echo 2, dressed in the garb of a cable repairman, was up on the utility pole, tapping the phones, internet, and TV service of the Jones family. "Echo 1, what is the subject doing? Over." To make this conversation the least bit intelligible, we will dispense with the call signs and other official agent BS. Echo 1 studied one of the monitors before answering. As far as I can tell, he's reading a comic book. 5 hours earlier at 2 a.m., Blackbird 1 and 2 had wired every room of the Jones house for remote video using optical fiber cables tipped with tiny cameras. The operation was being run by the FBI, whose orders identified Jimmy as essential to national security and therefore a possible target of terrorists hoping to injure the United States of America. What comic book? Space Blasters, Volume 7, Number 21. When can you recover it? Tonight. We'll buy a copy when the subject is in school and go in tonight to substitute it. Jimmy! Mrs. Jones' voice came over one of the speakers. Come on, you'll miss the bus. Coming, Mom, followed by sounds of Jimmy clattering down the stairs. Don't forget your lunch. Sound of a kiss. Bye, Mom. On one of the video monitors inside the van, the front door of the Jones house opened, and Jimmy emerged, whirled around, and slammed the door closed, and then ran down the walk to the corner, knapsack banging between his shoulder blades, to join other kids waiting for the bus. When the school bus arrived, Echo 2 climbed down from the pole and got into the van, removed his hard hat, and slid into the driver's seat. The van pulled out to follow the bus. It would take up position outside Jimmy's school and monitor him throughout the day, although it would be another 24 hours before Blackbird team could bug Jimmy's classroom the way they had bugged his home. Inside the school bus, Jimmy worked his way down the aisle. Hey, Jimmy. Hey, Brad. Hey. The driver of the bus spoke subvocally into the throat mic taped to his larynx and hidden by the shirt that was buttoned all the way up. Subject acquired, he said in Hebrew. He was a new driver, hired to replace the one who had suddenly taken a leave of absence to visit his sick mother in Israel. His transmission was boosted by the rig carried in his lunchbox on the floor of the bus and picked up by the Mossad team that paced the route the bus took a few streets over, in a van that bore the legend, Moishe's Deli. Every few houses the van would stop and an agent would jump out and leave some fresh bagels, lox, and cream cheese on the doorstep with a flyer promoting the deli. The transmission was also picked up by a helicopter circling overhead that bore the logo of a television station that didn't exist. The fuck? The pilot said. He was CIA. Control, this is Birdseye. The Thebes are following the school bus. We picked up a transmission from the bus in Hebrew and there's another van shadowing the bus. At Langley, the Bird's controller turned to the analyst and raised an inquiring eyebrow. The analyst explained. The Israelis hope this kid's invention will die on the vine. Huh? The controller looked astonished. That doesn't make sense. The kid's machine could make the bottom drop out of the world market for oil. It would destroy the Arab states' economies. Why would Israel want to suppress it? What will the Arab states do when their economies are in ruins? Blame Israel and go to war. Even if Israel defeats them all, it would be surrounded by 20 million desperate Arabs who have no jobs. Do the Arabs also have the kid under surveillance? Not directly. They're partnering with the Israelis on this one. Meanwhile, back in Detroit, yeah, the FBI, the CIA, and Mossad working with the Saudi intelligence service. They're all over the Jones kid and his family, his school, his friends, his neighbors. Each of them has orders to kill the kid if it looks like someone else is going to grab him. Okay, good work. Keep me posted. The executive leaned forward and switched off the video conference unit. The image of the man on the screen winked out. He turned to the other senior staff in the room. Well, they've got him covered tighter than the president. No way we're going to get to him. What about the camp guy, Jeffrey something? Jeffords. We've tried everything. Hypnosis, drugs. He just doesn't know how the kid did it. What about reverse engineering? One of the subordinates gave a short laugh. Been tried. The feds took it apart and duplicated it piece by piece. Didn't work. But when they put the original back together, it worked just fine. Driving them nuts. He suddenly looked haggard. Me too. The executive looked at them all for a few seconds and said, "Okay, dismissed." The others filed out and left him alone. He swiveled his chair around and looked out the window at the landscape grounds that surrounded the offices. If only they could get their hands on the kid, strike a deal with his parents maybe. With one of those in every car and truck, no dependence on gasoline, no compliance with EPA regulations, no hassles from environmental groups, they'd have it made in the shade. Outside, the groundsmen were carefully mowing the grass around the 60-foot GM logo that was picked out in ornamental plantings. And so in the days and weeks that followed, the Jones household was kept under surveillance by 18 foreign and domestic organizations that competed to sort through their garbage and monitor their every snore, fart, and belch. A media outlet owned by Rupert Murdoch hired a little person, to enroll in Jimmy's school and try to infiltrate his circle of friends. The midgets planted by the CIA, the FBI, and Larry King ran him off pretty quick. Every 24 hours, teams of analysts pored over photographs of the models that Jimmy was working on, doodles that he drew in class, and the homework that he turned in, hoping to find the Rosetta Stone to his Perpetual motion machine, or perhaps some new and even more startling invention, like anti-gravity. The Jones family seemed to be oblivious to the attention. Jimmy's grades were good, but he showed no signs of becoming another Einstein. But then, Einstein showed no signs of becoming Einstein when he was 9, one of the analysts pointed out. They were divided over the significance of Jimmy's marvelous invention, some hailing it as a breakthrough which would start another great age of discovery and technological advance, like the steam engine or the laser, while others grimly insisted that it would turn out to be nothing more than a showy effect of some kind, like the artificial lightning generator in the Museum of Science. The arguments on both sides were often creative and exciting, so much so that they often continued after normal working hours at various watering holes, where the consumption of alcoholic beverages inevitably led to a diminishment in the intellectual content and not infrequently to an exchange of fisticuffs. Inside the surveillance van, the monitors displayed the same scene from varying distances and angles, including overhead. Jimmy on his bike practicing wheelies in the parking lot of a supermarket. The figure on its bike headed out of the parking lot, and suddenly one of the 2 technicians in the van started. "Hey, the kid isn't pedaling." The other technician looked at his screen and said, "So what? He's coasting." "No, damn it, the bike's going uphill." Both men zoomed in for a closer look and saw that attached to the rear wheel of the bike was an exact copy of Jimmy's Perpetual motion machine. "What do you mean he stopped buying gas?" The FBI agent was standing in the office of his supervisor, who had summoned him after coming across the following sentence in the agent's daily report on the surveillance of the Jones family. "Subject's father continues to drive to work each day, but has not been observed buying gasoline since surveillance commenced." Maybe his wife fills the tank. "Sir, she has her own car. So far as we can tell, she stopped buying gas also. We can't detect any emissions from the exhaust system on either car." "You mean?" The agent nodded to his boss. "Yeah, they must have hooked up the kid's little gadget to the drivetrain." That evening, the president met with his cabinet. They all had copies of the FBI's report on the results of its surveillance of the Jones family. The Treasury Secretary spoke first, followed by the Secretary of Defense. "Mr. President, the world's oil markets are already unsettled. Rumors are cropping up that we have a process for generating cheap energy. If the oil markets collapse, the Dow could drop below 300. The savings of millions of Americans would be wiped out. Mr. President, the Saudis are demanding that we suppress this invention. If the price of oil continues to drop, the entire region will be destabilized." The president stood up and threw his copy of the report on the table. "Well, what the fuck are we supposed to do about it?" He turned around and kicked his chair. "Fuck!" "Sir," this from Homeland Security, "I recommend that we take the boy into custody as a matter of national security." There were head nods all around the table. "Can we do that?" "Yes, sir. Under the Patriot Act of 2002 as amended in 2003, we can do anything we want to in the name of Homeland Security. Well, what are you waiting for? At 3:30 a.m., a dozen vehicles coasted silently to a stop on the streets in front of and behind the Jones house, and a small army of federal ninjas swarmed inside it. The couple, surprised in bed, sat up, blinking into the lights that surrounded them and the small boy plucked from his bed in the room next to theirs. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Blackbird said, "Hey, you're not Richard and Edith Jones, are you?" His flashlight swung over to the boy in his PJs. "And you're not Jimmy either." "No, we're not. The Jones asked us to house sit for them while they were away. Can you shine that light somewhere else, please?" Jimmy explained it to me on the way home from school that day. "They've been watching us for so long, they don't really see us anymore," my dad says. "So you and I ride over to my house. We change clothes with each other. I leave on your bike and you stay in my place. My mom and dad do the same thing with your parents." He thought for a second. "I'll give you my blaster ball password so you can log on as me." "But they'll find you anyways, won't they?" Jimmy shrugged. "Maybe. My dad's pretty smart, though. And in a few months, we won't have to hide out anymore." "How come?" Jimmy smiled. "I'll show you." And he did. But I was sad to say goodbye to Jimmy. What Jimmy showed me was how he made his perpetual motion machine. You see, Mr. Jeffords and the other grown-ups from the university wanted Jimmy to explain to them how his machine worked, and Jimmy didn't know how to explain it to them. He could have showed them how he made it, only they never asked him to do that. So he showed me how, and I made one. The next day after school, I showed some other kids how to do it. It wasn't hard. "It's my dad's idea," Jimmy told me. "He showed me the math, and it's really cool. In a few days, too many kids will know how to make them for the government to stop them from spreading, and nobody will be able to have a monopoly on it." "Like the game?" "Yeah, kinda. But because one person has to show another how to make them, it won't happen too fast. Dad says that the world is going to need time to adjust." Over the next few months, as Jimmy had predicted, the knowledge of how to build the machine spread by word of mouth. First from kid to kid, then from parent to parent. People found all sorts of ways to use them. A lot of kids used them on their bikes. Old people used them to get around. Farmers modified their tractors to use them. But although they were easy enough for anybody to make, most people didn't have the skill or the tools with which to modify their cars, appliances, or other things that needed power. The auto mechanics who found their regular business drying up started offering to do that kind of work. Yeah, the bigger companies made a fuss, and the stock market went down a lot. For a while, you couldn't turn on your TV without getting an earful. But there really was no turning back, and so people adjusted. Not all of the voices were critical. I remember seeing pictures on TV of farmers in India and Africa who had power to operate their wells and purify the water for the first time in their lives. But the neatest thing was that each and every one of the perpetual motion machines was made exactly as Jimmy had made his first one. And so, all over the world, each and every one of them spelled out Mom in little lights. That's the end of my story about Jimmy Jones. But here's an excerpt from my novella, Tides, which is about a small fishing village in Maine named Dorset, where a construction company wants to build a tidal generating power plant. There are towns in Maine with fancy names, names of cities and even countries from all around the globe. Paris, Athens, Moscow, Mexico, Belgrade, Sweden, China, Denmark, Dresden, Lebanon, Naples, Palermo, Peru, Sorrento, Stockholm, Rome, Wales. Even names of some cities long dead, Smyrna, Carthage, Troy. But not all who settled the land had a flair for romance. It was fisher folk who settled in the cove and named it Slackwater, for reasons not even worth speculating about now. But when it came time for the town to incorporate, there were some citizens who thought that the original name would invite people from away to label them all as slackers, a sobriquet they reserved for themselves. They decided on Dorset instead. Dorset Cove looks something like a pork chop, with the bone starting in the south and curving to the northwest, and the meat of the chop facing east and northeast. The bone points upstream along the Quebec River, which feeds into the cove. There were two places where the ocean entered and exited the cove, into and out of the Gulf of Maine. The first, the gut, was through a narrow opening to the northeast, where it passed under a bridge that permitted vehicular traffic to flow between North Dorset and Dorset proper. A second, somewhat larger opening, the mouth, was located almost due south. The tides in the cove averaged between 20 and 23 feet and ran through the gut at speeds that reached 6 knots, almost 7 miles per hour. The language of tidal forces is suggestive. Tides are a secondary effect of the force of gravity, which is an attractive force that exists between two bodies, such as the Earth and its satellite. The moon always presents the same face to the Earth, but the Earth rotates on its axis, and the oceans, being fluid, are pulled towards the moon by the gravitational attraction between the two bodies. The moon's pull creates tides on land as well, causing the Earth's surface to rise and fall about 8 inches, which perhaps explains the legend of the moon's influence on people. And sometimes a third body enters the picture and exerts its attractive force on one of the other two bodies, which is then pulled back and forth between them and is heated up by friction as the tidal forces work back and forth over it. Tinker's Lane ambled along the waterfront of Dorset Harbor, necessarily one way since it was so narrow. A street that dated back to the days when the village was still named Slackwater, and the internal combustion engine was an odd-toed ungulate mammal belonging to the taxonomic family Equidae that was fueled by cellulose. The houses along Tinker's Lane were all owned by people who had grown up in Dorset, whose forebears were original slackers. They had so far resisted the overtures of realtors, vacationers, and rich tourists from away, who coveted a charming cottage on the water, painted in lavender, mango, green, gray, or whatever other color of paint could be had for little or no money, and constructed in an architectural style that might best be described as free-range American. Picturesque is how a realtor would describe Tinker's Lane to someone from the Upper East Side of Manhattan with deep pockets. The street was a favorite subject for middle-aged women and men somewhat older than middle age, who vied with one another for the best spot at the head of the lane to set up their easels, starting in June and continuing through Labor Day. In the early morning, too early for tourists to be out and about, the men who fished and lobstered and scalloped for a living congregated at Sally's Diner on Tinker's Wharf, open at 4 and crowded by 4:30. The smell of fried grease and hash browns and fresh coffee, a familiar background, as with the sounds of low voices in conversation. In winter, the sky was still dark when the men swilled the last of their coffees and mopped up the last of their egg yolks with the fresh bread that Sally had made, and headed outside, where they could light up a cigarette and head for their boats, and out of the harbor to earn a living from the sea. In summer, the sun streamed in at almost 5 a.m. through the windows of the restaurant facing east into Dorset Cove, sometimes making spokes through the clouds and gilding their bottoms.